Hey everyone, this is Steamboy. Welcome back to part two of the making of the Elon Musk animated pixel portrait. So in this section, I'm going to talk about how I transformed the cyborg brain into the cybertruck. So let's get started. So the basic idea here was to transform the brain into a cybertruck, much like classic transformers would transform like from a robot into a vehicle. So I'll get more in detail on the transformation a little bit later. But first, what I do here is I separate the pieces of the brain, much like I did with the skull and the face in the last video. And basically, I have everything broken down into three major parts. So there's the frontal lobe, or whatever you call it, of the brain, and that part I want to rotate kind of forwards. The two side panels I want to rotate from the flip out to be the sides of the car, and then the back side of the brain kind of like tumble along a middle axis and become like the back of the car. So I separate out the front piece, I draw the back side of the back piece, and then right away I start to animate the front piece kind of tumbling forward. And I realized I was so excited to do this because I wanted to try out and see what it looked like that I hadn't even designed the Cybertruck at this point. So I bring out my Cybertruck um, reference, and I decide, okay, before I do any animation, I gotta make sure I have a solid pixel version of the Cybertruck. So I chose to do kind of like a isometric perspective. It's not perfectly isometric. I think the hardcore isometric artist would kind of like scoff at this, but I generally use like something that was like a 3/4 down, just because I knew I wanted to launch that starship from the back. So I felt like this was a pretty good angle. It matched, the size of or the angle of the brain as well. And that was the tricky part. You can already see here that, I mentioned before, the brain is so smooth and organic, while the Cybertruck is really angular. So I'm really hoping the transition within the transformation is going to help me smooth that out. So here I have my final rough. Um, the first time I really did anything kind of isometric. So what I did was I found the quote unquote parallel straight lines for each of the sides, each of the angles. I'm going to use these as reference for any type of straight line that I'll need for that side of the car. So you can see here, I basically copy and paste those reference lines and use them as building blocks to get those straight lines to be nice and parallel on each side of the truck. And again, I kind of have no idea what I'm doing here in terms of isometric pixel art. So this is kind of just the way that I ended up doing it, but there might be a better way out there. And here I'm just making a couple ellipses with the selection tool, and then I do an inside stroke at 1 pixel to get the wheels. And then just some final touches here, just the separations of the doors. And I think that's pretty much the line art for the Cybertruck. Then I go on to fill in with some flat colors. And here I brought the brain back up, and I'm color picking the different tones I used on the brain earlier. That way when it transforms, it can have the same metal colors. I also brought up the skull to use some of the dark grays for some of the fenders and bumpers and the darker gray areas on the car. And when you get to this scale of pixel art, it gets, your decision making becomes really important because you don't have that much real estate to work with. So every single little line and bevel becomes really important. So just getting the wheels done here. And the tricky thing about doing cars in pixel art is that you have to cut up the car into different pieces so the wheels kind of overlap, parts of the car but not others. Finishing off with the windshield, making sure we can see some of the inside of the car, and then some reflections to make it feel more like glass. So here's what I'm talking about with the wheels. I had to cut the car up into a couple pieces. That way the front part of the truck overlaps the front wheels, but then the wheels overlap the middle part, and then I'm cutting out the back part here so that the rear wheels overlap the back part, but is overlapped by the middle part. That way I can animate the car kind of like bouncing up and down to mimic the car moving. So there it is, that's the final Cybertruck. And if you compare it to the brain here, it's very different in terms of shape language. So it's going to be interesting to see how we transform it. So I start by doing some keyframes for the side panel, which will rotate into the side part of the car. And I grew up watching the Transformers cartoons, and I had tons of Transformer toys. I just loved like transforming them and seeing how they all work. So that was a huge inspiration here, and I definitely wanted it to feel like a Transformer transforming. But obviously, a Transformer goes from a robot to a car, and here I'm going from like a almost like a round object to a car. So you'll notice as I'm transforming these side parts, they get more and more angular. The piece gets more angular until I use the actual art from the Cybertruck as the final few frames. So basically, as it's rotating, it's tricking your eye because it happens so fast. The piece it goes from something that's more curved to something that's more flat. And then here I'm just adjusting some of the final frames to give it some of that overshoot. So it goes in for one frame, then it comes back out, giving it a nice snappy feel. Then continue with the front piece. If you guys remember, I started this before I even designed the truck. And now I'm going to continue on, and the same way with the side panels, as this piece is rotating, I'm changing it to make it feel more angular. So as you can see here, it's already become a more angular piece. And here's a quick test to see how it's going. And then I quickly switched to grabbing a piece of the actual Cybertruck to use for the final few frames like I did with the side. So you can see here the last two frames I used the actual art from the Cybertruck, and that way the transition it kind of fools you into believing that it changed into that front part. See those two frames there? All right, so next I realized I wanted to cut out some of the lower parts of the brain. I needed to hide that lower part and have it move under. And then also I'm doing some of the outlines to make sure the pieces individually have outlines like I did with the face panels. Detailing the inside back so that when it opens there's some kind of detail there. And then I start to color the keyframes here. So it's cleaning up that line art I did earlier. Always flipping back and forth with the other frames to make sure that the movement seems smooth. And you'll notice one of the middle colors that we have here for the shading, it's a little bit pinkish red. Um, that's one of the things like when you're doing pixel art, it's always interesting to pick one of those Terminator colors, those colors in between the light and shadow, and give it a little bit of a different hue. It really brings the color to life. And here I chose a pink because the background's red, so I'm just imagining it's picking up some of that red from the background around it. So here I just continue to clean up some of those frames for the front rotation. You'll notice there's the Neuralink logo. So it was kind of a hassle trying to rotate that, but that adds to the believability of that piece moving. So I think I forgot to record the bit where the back half of the car kind of like rotates in the other axis, but you can kind of see the line art here that I did for that as I'm flipping through the frames here. Yeah, here's where I try to copy and paste that Neuralink logo. Here's a 90-degree rotation, and then just like copying bits of it and just adjusting it to make it look like it's rotating. So because the brain piece that rotated in was mostly metal, didn't have the front bumper, I decided to bring that in from the bottom after the front piece rotates. So I grabbed that piece from the finished Cybertruck, and then in the last few frames after the full rotation, I just kind of reveal pieces of it so you can kind of see it coming in from the bottom here. Another thing you'll notice is my layers are all messed up right now. Like the wheels are being overlapped by some weird gray piece. There's holes. All that stuff I clean up at the end once I have most of my animation done. Here's a quick run to see what I've got so far, and I think most of the basic elements are in now. I'm playing around with getting the wheels to fall down. Send some of the frames there. So since I feel pretty good about that, I decide to go and color and render those side panels that rotate. Going in frame by frame, getting the right colors, cleaning up the line art, making them feel 3D, making that wheel rotate from the other side. So I thought it'd be cool to have the front headlight, that horizontal line that's on the Cybertruck, to animate in at the very end. So just doing that. And here's a quick run. So I still have that back piece of the car to render out, but it's feeling pretty good. So I go in and I clean up the frames for that back half. Make sure those little circular sockets that I put in there are rotating properly. So this piece, instead of really kind of like morphing it as it's rotating, I just decided that this piece would be like hard angled on the underside, and then curvy on the top side. So when it rotates 180, it shows the other side, which is completely polygonal. So just throwing in some of the windows here. And you can see me kind of cleaning up some of the spots that aren't overlapping nicely or just aren't really consistent on the rotation. And here's the final animation for the transformation. So the last sequence I'm going to go over here is the landing of the truck. So after the transformation, the truck goes into free fall and then lands on the ground. So I use a lot of warping here because it's just slight angles of rotation. So I just do a quick, like a shear or a skew warp here, but then you can see the front end doesn't match up. So I cut back out the front end because that shouldn't rotate too much. And now that feels better. So I'm just having it kind of like the back drop a little bit, the back half of the truck. And then the front of it kind of trails, and then it gives it a nice layered feel. So I'm just cleaning up some of the pixels here from the warping, making sure the wheels, like I don't want to warp the wheels because they're round, they should stay the same. So every time I warp the truck, I take the original wheel and I put it back in there. So I'm just working on the bounce here, and because the end it travels quite a distance, I want to have a smear frame. So just before it kind of lands, I have the front of the car stretch. One of your basic animation principles, squash and stretch. So to really sell the car landing, it's nice to have the shadow underneath. That way you get a sense of where the ground plane is. So here I am just blocking out the basic shapes and then having the shadow, get bigger as the truck gets nearer to the ground. And it was really tricky to get those final couple frames because the car does a little bit of a bounce and I wasn't sure how much of the shadow should really change shape in those final frames. But yeah, so there you can see it kind of fades in opacity too. And here's the final fall or land. And it took me a while to adjust the bounciness of the truck. I had a few versions where it was way too bouncy and it just didn't feel like it had the same weight. So what I do next here is I export my file for After Effects. I'm going to go over in the next video exactly how I set up my animation files before bringing it to After Effects. There's a couple of tricks I use, so you can kind of just see me here consolidating all the frames, deleting the ones I don't need. Again, I'll go over that in detail in my next video. But thanks for checking this one out. That's the Cybertruck transformation. Don't forget to leave some comments if you have questions. And thanks for checking it out. See you in the next one.